The sentence that changed everything wasn't shouted. That's the strange part. My father said it the way people comment on the weather, calm and matter of fact, like it had been sitting in his mind for years and he was finally tired of holding it back. You don't even have a real life. Lila, you're just nobody. The words landed in the middle of the living room and stayed there. No one laughed. No one told him he'd gone too far. For a moment, I honestly wondered if I'd heard him wrong. The heater was rattling near the wall, and a cup of coffee had been sitting on the table long enough to smell burnt. Maybe the noise twisted the sentence. But no, everyone heard it. My sister Caroline leaned against the kitchen counter with her arms crossed, still wearing the tailored blazer she always arrived in from San Francisco. My brother Noah stared down at his phone like the floor had suddenly become fascinating. My mother Diane let out a slow sigh, the tired kind people make when they've already decided how the conversation will end. And my father Harold just stood there, watching me, waiting. My name is Lila Rowan. I'm 27 years old. That afternoon had started as what my mother called a family meeting. In my experience, those aren't really meetings. They're more like quiet trials where the verdict has already been chosen. The topic was my grandmother Eleanor. Her memory had been slipping for months. At first, it was small things, repeated questions, forgotten appointments. Lately, it had been worse. She left the stove on last week. Yesterday, she called me by her own name. My parents had already found a place for her, a nursing facility outside Bend, clean rooms, professional care. There was even a glossy brochure on the coffee table showing gray-haired couples playing board games under soft lighting. Caroline tapped the brochure and said, "This is the responsible choice." Noah nodded. "It's the safest option." Then they looked at me, like they were humoring someone younger than the rest of them. I shook my head. "I'll take care of her." Caroline laughed under her breath. "With what? Exactly?" Dad didn't laugh. He leaned forward slightly and said the sentence that ended the conversation. "You can't even support yourself, Lila. You're still drifting through life. Nobody builds a future like that." The room went quiet again. I stood there for a moment, feeling something settle in my chest, not anger. Exactly. Something colder. Something final. Then I took my phone out of my pocket and walked toward the front door. No speech. No argument. Just a call. When the line connected, I said one sentence. "Claire, it's time. Bring the helicopter." People think the moment everything broke was that sentence in my father's living room. Honestly, no. That moment started years earlier, back when I was the kid at the dinner table who never had the right thing to say. Our house in Bend was always loud at dinner. Forks clinking, chairs scraping. My dad talking like every conversation was a staff meeting. Caroline would start. I made the top argument in mock trial today. Dad would grin. "That's my girl." Then Noah. My app hit 5,000 downloads. Dad would nod like he was approving a business proposal. Good. Keep building. Then everyone would turn to me. You ever feel that moment when a room waits for you to prove you belong in it? Yeah. I'd clear my throat and say something like, "I wrote a new song." Silence. Not angry silence. Worse. Polite silence. Mom would take a sip of water and say, "That's nice, Lila." Dad usually followed with, "But how are your grades?" Caroline once laughed and said, "You can't live off guitar chords." I remember saying, "I'm not trying to." Dad leaned back in his chair. "Then what are you trying to do?" I didn't answer. Because honestly, I didn't have the words yet. The only person who didn't look at me like I'd brought the wrong language to dinner was my grandfather, Walter Bennett. He'd sit at the end of the table, quiet most of the night, fingers tapping invisible rhythms against the wood. One evening, he looked at my father and said, "You know, some people don't think in spreadsheets." Dad laughed. "Music doesn't pay the bills." Walter. Grandpa shrugged. "Neither did my trumpet for a long time." Mom shook her head. "This is exactly what worries us." After dinner, Grandpa would usually slip outside with me. The back porch always smelled faintly like old wood and rain. He'd pull out that dented trumpet case, play me something. He'd say, "I'm still learning." I'd tell him. That's the point. One night I asked him, "Do you think Dad's right?" He looked at me for a long second. Then he said quietly, "Your father understands certainty. Music isn't certain." I laughed a little. That sounds like a problem. Grandpa smiled. "No," he said. "That sounds like freedom." And I swear, that was the first time someone made my confusion feel like something valuable. Still, the truth is, the Rowan house didn't run on freedom. It ran on results. And sooner or later, my father was going to ask the question that changed everything. You going to college or not? The college brochures started showing up before senior year even ended. Stacks of them. Engineering programs, business schools, law tracks Caroline swore would change my life. One morning they were spread across the kitchen table like someone had dealt out a hand of cards. Mom said, "We should talk about applications." Dad added, "Deadlines are coming up." Caroline was visiting that weekend. She flipped through one of the packets and slid it toward me. "This one's solid." She said, "Good music department too." I didn't touch it. Noah sat at the end of the table with his laptop open, pretending to work but listening to everything. Dad looked at me. "So, where are you applying?" I said the thing I'd been rehearsing for weeks. "I'm not." The table went quiet. Mom blinked like she hadn't heard correctly. "Not yet." "No," I said. "Not at all." Caroline leaned back in her chair. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm focusing on music." Dad laughed once. Short, sharp. "You mean playing guitar in your room?" "No," I said. "Writing songs." Mom pressed her fingers to her temple. "Lila, be serious." "I am serious." Caroline shook her head. "You're throwing away your future." Noah finally spoke. "What's the plan then?" I shrugged. "Work. Write music." Dad pushed his chair back a little. "And you think you're doing that here?" I didn't answer right away. You ever realize you're standing on a line you didn't even know existed until someone points it out? Dad leaned forward. "If you don't go to college, you're not living here," Mom whispered. "Harold." He didn't look at her. "This house isn't a rehearsal studio." Caroline crossed her arms. "He's right." I remember staring down at the brochures, the paper edges scratching against my fingers. Then I stood up. 2 weeks later, I packed everything I owned into one duffel bag. My guitar, some clothes, and the $2,400 I'd saved from summer jobs. Mom watched from the hallway when I carried the bag to the door. She said quietly, "You can still change your mind." Dad stayed in the kitchen. Didn't say goodbye. Outside, the air smelled like wet pavement. I threw the bag into the back of my car and sat there for a second. Then I started the engine. Because honestly, once you walk out once, there's no such thing as halfway anymore. The apartment above the bookstore wasn't much. One room, a sink that rattled when the pipes kicked on, floorboards that creaked every time I shifted my weight. But it was mine. The first night I sat on the floor with my guitar and thought, okay, now what? Because leaving home feels heroic for about 12 hours. After that, reality shows up. Most mornings started at the Riverfront Brewery. The place always smelled like spilled beer and fryer oil. I worked the lunch shift first. My manager, Rick, handed me an apron on day one. "You ever carried 6 plates at once?" he asked. "No." "You will." That was the training. I worked 5 days a week, sometimes 6. Tourists, rafters, families passing through Bend. The tips paid rent most months. Barely. One night, a guy at the bar asked, "What do you do when you're not here?" "I write music." He nodded slowly. "That sounds expensive." I laughed. It mostly costs sleep. Anyway, after closing, I'd climb the narrow stairs back to the apartment. My guitar sat against the wall like it had been waiting all day. Some nights, nothing came. Other nights, the songs spilled out so fast I couldn't keep up. Mom called once a week. "Are you eating enough?" she'd ask. "I'm fine. You could come home and take a few classes." "I'm good." "Mom." She'd pause. Then she'd say softly, "Your father still thinks you're wasting time." Dad called less. When he did, the conversations were short. "You find a real job, yet I have a job." You know what I mean. Noah texted sometimes. "You could still learn coding." He wrote once. I typed back. "You could learn guitar." He never answered that one. The only calls I actually looked forward to were from Grandpa Walter. His voice always crackled through the phone like an old radio signal. "You still writing?" he'd ask. "Yeah, that's the only answer I want." One winter night, my phone rang just after midnight. It was Grandma Eleanor. Her voice sounded wrong. "Lila," she said, "it's your grandfather." My stomach dropped. He had a heart attack. I grabbed my jacket and ran down the stairs so fast I nearly slipped. The cold air outside burned my lungs. By the time I got to the hospital, Grandma was sitting alone in the waiting room. She looked up at me. Then she shook her head. That's all it took. Later that night, I went back to my apartment. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the heater. I picked up my guitar, and I started writing. Because when someone who believed in you disappears, sometimes the only thing left to do is turn that silence into a song. The song I wrote the night my grandfather died was called "Last Brass in the Rain." I didn't plan it. I barely remember recording it. My eyes were swollen from crying, and my fingers ached from playing the same chords over and over. Before sunrise, I uploaded a rough demo to a small songwriting forum I used sometimes. No announcement, no expectations. Just a song I didn't know what to do with. Then I went to work. Rick took one look at me when I walked into the brewery. "You look terrible," he said. "Didn't sleep. Breakups will do that." I let him think that. For a while, nothing happened. A few people online left comments about the melody. Someone asked for the chords. I figured that would be the end of it. About 3 weeks later, my phone buzzed while I was wiping down a table. The email subject line read, "Song Inquiry." I almost deleted it. Instead, I opened it. "Hi," it said. "I'm producing an independent record in Portland. We heard your track "Last Brass in the Rain." "Did you write it?" I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back. "Yes." That message started a chain of conversations I didn't really understand yet. The producer asked if he could record the song with one of his artists. I learned a new word that week: licensing. A month later, the track appeared on someone else's album. Hearing another voice sing words I wrote in my tiny apartment felt strange, like listening to a stranger tell a story that used to belong to me. But the song traveled farther than I expected. Nothing explosive. No overnight success. Just quiet momentum. A music supervisor asked if the song could be used in a small television drama. A songwriter from Austin emailed asking if I'd co-write. Someone from a publishing company wanted to hear more demos. That's when a producer named Gabe called me. "You should use a pen name," he said. "Why most writers stay behind the curtain. Artists like the spotlight. Writers don't always need it." I looked out the window at the rain sliding down the glass. "Rowan Vale," I said. Gabe paused. "I like that." That name started appearing in songwriting credits. Small ones at first. Then a few bigger placements. The money didn't arrive all at once. It came slowly: royalties here, licensing fees there, the occasional check that felt unreal compared to my tips at the brewery. But back home, nothing changed. Mom still asked if I'd found a better job. Dad still assumed I was drifting. And once, when Caroline thought I couldn't hear her on the phone, she said, "My sister's still figuring her life out." I never corrected them, because the truth was simple. The music world knew Rowan Vale, but to my family, Lila Rowan was still the girl serving beer by the river. For a while after the music started paying the bills, life settled into something almost steady. I wrote songs, quietly. Checks arrived under the name Rowan Vale, quietly. And every Sunday I drove across Bend to visit my grandmother Eleanor in the small house she had shared with my grandfather Walter for more than 40 years. The place always smelled faintly of lavender soap and old wood. At first, the changes were small. One Tuesday afternoon, she opened the door, looked straight at me, and said politely, "Hello, dear. Can I help you?" I laughed. "Grandma, it's me." She blinked, studying my face for a moment before recognition returned. "Oh, Lila. Of course." We made tea and sat at the kitchen table like we always did. 10 minutes later, she asked, "Did you hear about Walter?" My chest tightened. "Grandma, Grandpa died 3 years ago." Her expression flickered with confusion and then embarrassment, like someone who had misplaced an important thought. "Right," she said softly. "Of course." After that, the moments started happening more often. She left the stove on twice in 1 week. Once I found her purse inside the refrigerator next to the milk. Another afternoon, she called me Margaret. Margaret was her own name. I finally took her to a neurologist. The doctor spoke carefully, using the kind of calm voice people use when the truth is heavier than the room can hold. Early-stage Alzheimer's. Grandma sat quietly in the chair while I asked the questions. "How quickly does it progress?" "It's different for everyone," he said. "Months for some, years for others." In the car afterward, Grandma reached over and touched my hand. "Don't tell your parents yet," she said. "Why not? They'll panic." But they found out anyway. A week later, Mom called. "Your father and I have been talking," she said carefully. "It might be time to consider professional care." "You mean a nursing home? It's a memory care facility," she corrected gently. I stared out the window of my apartment. "No. Lila, you don't realize how difficult this will become. I'll manage." With what money, I almost laughed. "Mom," I said, "I'll figure it out." That night, I called Claire. Claire had started working with me 2 years earlier when the music business became too complicated to manage alone contracts, licensing agreements, travel, publishing paperwork. She answered on the second ring. "What's going on?" she asked. "My grandmother's sick." Silence filled the line for a moment. Then I said the thing that had been forming in my mind all day. "I think she needs a different place to live. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere safe." "For you?" Claire asked. "No," I said. "For her?" Claire didn't hesitate. "All right," she said. "Then let's find her a home." When I stepped out of my parents' front door, the air felt colder than it had a moment earlier. Maybe it wasn't the temperature. Maybe it was the sentence still echoing in my head. "You're nobody." Some words don't leave you. They settle somewhere deep and stay there. I walked down the street toward the old soccer field 3 blocks away. My boots scraped against the damp pavement, and the wind carried the smell of wet grass from the empty lot. Behind me, the front door opened. Caroline's voice came first. "Is she serious right now?" Noah answered quietly. "I think she is." Dad's voice followed, impatient and certain. "Let her go. She'll cool off and come back." I kept walking. The field was empty when I reached it, just a wide stretch of grass bordered by a line of old maple trees. The place had been used years ago for youth games, but now it mostly sat unused except for the occasional dog walker. I stood in the middle of it and waited. My phone buzzed. "Claire, aircraft is about 8 minutes out," she said. Pilot confirmed the coordinates. "You're sure he can land here? We checked the field earlier today." She replied, "It's clear enough. Don't worry." I exhaled slowly. "Thanks." "You all right?" she asked. "I will be." Across the street, I could see the lights in my parents' living room glowing through the windows. A few seconds later, the front door opened again. Dad stepped outside first, walking halfway down the driveway. "Lila," he called. "Stop being ridiculous." Caroline followed him, arms crossed tightly against the cold. "This is embarrassing." Noah lingered near the porch steps, watching the field. Mom stayed in the doorway, gripping the frame with both hands like she wasn't sure where she belonged. Dad looked out across the grass toward me. "Well," he shouted. "What exactly are you waiting for?" At first, the sound was faint, a distant thumping somewhere beyond the trees. Dad frowned. Caroline tilted her head. "What is that?" The noise grew louder, rolling across the sky in heavy pulses. Then the helicopter appeared above the tree line. It wasn't flashy, just a dark charter aircraft, but the rotors cut through the quiet neighborhood hard enough to send leaves spinning across the field. Wind flattened the tall grass around me. The aircraft circled once, the pilot clearly checking the landing area before bringing it down. Noah stepped off the porch slowly. "Is that coming here?" he asked. I didn't answer. The helicopter descended toward the field, the blades hammering the air. Gravel rattled against the sidewalk as it touched down. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Dad looked at me, his expression shifting from irritation to disbelief. "What is this?" I met his eyes. "A ride." The pilot climbed out and ducked beneath the slowing rotors. "Miss Rowan," he asked. "That's me." Dad's voice sounded thinner now. "You arranged this?" "Yes." I turned and walked back toward the house. Inside, Grandma Eleanor sat in her armchair beside the window. The distant rotor noise made the glass tremble. She looked up as I knelt beside her. "Oh," she said softly. "There you are. I'm here. Grandma." She tilted her head toward the sound outside. "What's all that noise?" I smiled gently. "We're going for a little ride." Getting Grandma Eleanor into the helicopter took a little time. She moved slowly now, carefully placing each step as if the ground might shift beneath her feet. The pilot held the door while I guided her up into the cabin. She studied the headset in her hands with a suspicious look. "What is this contraption?" "A helicopter," I said. "Well, I can see that," she muttered. "But why am I sitting in it? You'll understand soon." When I stepped back onto the grass, Dad was still standing where he had been, arms folded tightly across his chest. "We're not getting in that thing," he said. "You don't have to," I replied. Caroline shook her head. "This is completely ridiculous." Noah looked from the aircraft to me, then back again. After a moment, he said, "I'm getting in." Dad turned sharply. "Noah." "It's a ride," Noah said calmly. "I want to know where she's taking us." Mom climbed in next, quiet and tense. Caroline sighed in frustration. "Fine, but someone better explain this." Dad remained where he was for another few seconds, staring at the spinning blades. Finally, he walked toward the aircraft with the reluctant posture of someone signing a contract he didn't trust. Inside the cabin, the engine noise filled everything. The rotors thumped overhead and the seats vibrated beneath us as the pilot lifted the helicopter off the ground. Grandma leaned toward the window. "Oh," she whispered. The houses below shrank quickly, turning into small blocks of color as the town spread out beneath us. Roads became thin gray lines cutting through the valley. Grandma pointed toward the river. "Walter used to drive us there on Sundays," she said softly. For a moment, her voice sounded clear and certain, like it used to. Dad leaned across the cabin toward me. "Where exactly are we going?" he asked through the headset. "You'll see when we land." Caroline adjusted her headset with irritation. "If this is some kind of dramatic stunt, it isn't." Noah kept looking out the window as the mountains slowly rose in the distance. After a while, he said, almost to himself, "We're flying pretty far. About 40 minutes. I told him. Dad shook his head. "This kind of nonsense costs money." I didn't answer, because sometimes the only way to change someone's mind is to show them a place they never imagined existed. The helicopter touched down gently on the gravel clearing beside the house. The rotors slowed gradually while the pilot signaled that it was safe to step out. After the noise of the flight, the quiet hillside felt almost unreal. Dad leaned toward the window, staring across the property. Where are we? The house stood at the edge of a wide stretch of land outside Ashland. Rows of old vineyard vines climbed the hills behind it, their branches bare in the cold air. Caroline narrowed her eyes. "This isn't a hotel. No," I said. When the engine finally shut down, I helped Grandma Eleanor step onto the gravel path. She looked around slowly, taking in the porch, the hills, the open sky. "Oh," she said softly. Mom stepped down behind us. "Lila," she asked carefully, "what is this place?" Dad was already walking toward the front steps, studying the property the way he always studied expensive things. This land alone must cost. He stopped before finishing the sentence. Caroline followed him along the walkway. "You didn't rent this," she said. "No." Noah stood beside me, staring at the house. "You bought it." "Yes." Grandma squeezed my arm gently. "Is this where I'm staying?" "It is," I said. "There's a nurse arriving tomorrow, and a doctor in town who specializes in memory care." Inside, the house smelled faintly of new wood and fresh paint. Sunlight spilled across the living room floor through tall windows. Mom ran her hand along the back of a chair. "When did you do all this over the past year?" I said. Dad turned toward me. With what money, I took a breath. "You've heard the song, 'Last Brass in the Rain'." Caroline frowned. "Of course. It's everywhere lately." "I wrote it." She stared at me. "No, you didn't." "Yes." Dad crossed his arms. "One song doesn't buy a house like this." "No," I said calmly. "But years of writing songs can." Noah leaned forward. "For who? Different artists?" "Film and television projects. Licensing work." Caroline shook her head slowly. "So you're saying you're a professional songwriter now?" "I have been for a while." Dad studied my face carefully. "Under what name? Rowan Vale?" The silence that followed filled the entire room. Mom covered her mouth. Caroline whispered, "That's not possible." Noah lowered himself onto the edge of a chair. "You're serious." Dad spoke again after a long moment. "How much are we talking about?" "The catalog's current valuation is around $18 million, I said. No one moved. Grandma Eleanor was the only one smiling. She wandered toward the music room doorway and pointed inside. "Walter's trumpet," she said. I nodded. "Yes." Dad rubbed his forehead slowly. "You kept all of this from us." I met his eyes. "You never asked." And for the first time in that house, the balance of the room had quietly shifted. The first thing my father said after the silence finally broke was, "You kept this from us." I was leaning against the piano in the music room when he said it. I didn't lie. I replied, "You hid it. I tried to talk about music for years." I said quietly, "You just never thought it was worth listening to." Dad rubbed the back of his neck, the way he always did when he felt cornered by a conversation. "That's not the point." Caroline let out a small breath from across the room. "No," she said, "I think it actually is." Everyone turned toward her. She was standing by the window, looking out over the vineyard hills. "You spent 6 years thinking she had nothing," Caroline said slowly. "Meanwhile, she was building this." Noah gave a quiet laugh. "I always figured something was going on." Dad looked at him sharply. "You knew, no." Noah said, "But Lila's stubborn. I knew she wouldn't just disappear." Mom sat down at the dining table. Her expression still caught somewhere between shock and worry. "You should have told us," she said softly. "Would it have changed anything I asked?" She didn't answer. Grandma Eleanor wandered into the music room and lowered herself into the chair beside Walter's trumpet. Her fingers brushed the metal carefully. "Your grandfather always said music would carry you somewhere," she murmured. I picked up the guitar leaning against the wall and played the opening chords of Last Brass in the Rain. The sound filled the room quietly. Grandma closed her eyes. For a moment, everything else faded: the arguments, the disbelief, the long years between who they thought I was and who I had become. When the last chord faded, Noah spoke again. "I've been messing around with songwriting lately," he admitted. Dad blinked. "You too." Noah shrugged. "Nothing serious." I smiled at him. "That's usually how it begins." Caroline leaned against the window frame, watching the hills outside. "You know what the strange part is?" she said. "What Noah asked?" "I spent my whole life chasing the version of success Dad believed in." And she shrugged lightly. "I'm not sure it ever fit me either." Dad didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he looked at me. "I shouldn't have said what I said earlier. You did say it. I know." He paused, and I was wrong. Mom gave him a small sideways look. "Your father isn't very good at admitting that." "I'm trying," Dad muttered. Later that evening, we sat on the porch while the sun slipped behind the vineyard hills. The air was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a long storm finally passes. Grandma sat beside me in the rocking chair. "You didn't build this place to prove something to them," she said. "No. You built it because you loved your grandfather." I nodded. After a while, the others joined us outside. No arguments this time, just slow conversation drifting across the porch as the sky darkened. And somewhere in the house behind us, Walter's trumpet and my guitar were resting in the same room. That felt like enough, because sometimes the world decides who you are before you even have the chance to speak. But if you keep building the life that feels true to you, sooner or later the truth has a way of showing itself. Not loudly, just quietly, the way it did that evening. And the music, like always, kept playing.